here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the guitarist, songwriter and also author Dan Synge, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Has just published a fantastic new book titled Whatever Happened to the Teenage Dream? Postcards from the Edge of 80s Pop. One-time member of the combo titled Daniel Takes a Train, who I think, they reformed a few years ago, had a compilation on Fire Station Records and have recorded bits and pieces ever since. But anyway, this is his story, which has been beautifully told. But we'll find out more about the book and Daniel, or Dan, in this very engaging interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject of the book and why he wrote it. Anyway, Dan, take it away.
Teenage years were a long time ago, and I think the last time I spoke to you, my 80s band had just been signed after 30 years after being in the wilderness, and we had an album out called Style, Charm and Commotion by the band Daniel Takes a Train. So we were an 80s band that sort of tried to make it and didn't, and we made it in 2018, and it was just, for us it was a sort of nice little full stop on our career, and we had an album in our hands, the very thing we wanted when we were in our early 20s. And the band got back together and did a few gigs, and we had a kind of very interesting experience with a road manager, and we were thinking big again, and then it all kind of went a bit sort of back to basics, and we carried on making music, and we're still making music now. So there was that experience which happened to me in my mid-50s, twinned that sort of quite bizarre experience with having a short-lived pop career from, say, the early 80s to the end of the 80s. And I thought, well, let's put them together. Let's make sense of it. And also make sense of it as a music fan. In my 50s, I suddenly got back into music. I started going to gigs again. I started following new bands, and I was interested in that idea of, growing older and becoming a music fan. I deridingly call it being a sixth music dad in my prologue.
Yes.
But also, standing on stage and doing gigs, and quite frankly, it was I felt it a bit ridiculous, but very enjoyable. And it seemed to me that I wasn't alone. There were lots of people like me who had got back into music and, were forming bands. And, I just realized music is such a part of my life, and it always will be. And for that reason, I wanted to explore, if you like, seminal moments that got me into music and hooked me and kept me there. And I started to think, well, okay, so I could talk about my first record. I could talk about, the first band I saw, Fabulous Poodles. I could link all these things together and then bring it to the present, where I'm this rather sort of sad 50-something man in a band, sort of trying to get my music released. And I thought, well, it's got a bit of comedy value, let's face it.
Yes.
But also it's a real story. It's me. It's genuine, and it's okay. Well, I wasn't in Duran Duran or Tears for Fears, but I was inhabiting a similar universe, if you like, maybe without the limos and the videos in Thailand. But we did a video in Canvey Island, so we lived and breathed 80s music. And some of the people around us made it and some of them didn't.
Yes, absolutely. So then with that idea, when did you think, actually, this is actually going to be good enough for a sort of a sort of I suppose a document, in a book. When did that sort of come into your consciousness to think this is still good? Because often one gets an idea late at night, possibly after drinking and stuff, and then you wake up the next day and go, oh gosh, did I really think that? But you obviously went, no, this is a fantastic idea. I'm going all the way. Let's go back to the beginning.
Well, I was working as a university lecturer, and in my in my spare time, I was still writing. I was writing journalism and getting published. But then I thought, well, I can do this because I can write and I can just mine my memory bank. And I think the first few drafts were basically me writing about music. But then halfway through, and I showed it to a few people. It was just me showing off about my knowledge of music, which is all very well. I mean, anyone can do that. But I decided it would be a memoir, which means that you have to mine your own experiences and dramatize them. And you have to sort of put words into people's mouths and create scenes. And so having created, I think, enough scenes, I put it all together. And the book is a chronology from not the moment I was born, but sort of, early school days up until, leaving to work abroad when I was 22. So it's quite an intense period of your life. And also I had teenager children myself and was watching them and thinking, well, okay, I was a teenager a long time ago, but I can kind of relate to what they're thinking and how they behave. And my daughter was really into music, and we used to go to gigs together, and she would go to the front and I would stand at the back with my pint of craft beer, and we were sharing a love of music. And I was also kind of remembering my time. I was her age, and the thrill of, running to the front of a gig and all that stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And sort
There's
of
a lot going on. And hopefully, if people are curious about my life, they can find it. But also, if they're curious about what it's like to start a band and to keep a band going, and it talks about all the sort of practicalities of being in bands and dealing with people in bands and musical differences, rehearsals, all this kind of stuff. And maybe it's a sort of how to start your own band manifesto, or how to, and we're talking about a band that gate crashed the Brit Awards and were mentioned on Radio 1. So there was some near successes there.
Yes, absolutely.
As well as a fair amount of failure or sort of things that didn't quite work out, but in retrospect, are good memories.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I sort of loved it, but obviously on the same I must be the same age.
Laugh?
Pardon?
Did it make you laugh, or were you just sort of horrified?
Well, no, it did make me laugh, but also it was the kind of, I suppose, nod in a way to, oh yes, I remember that band, and oh yes, I remember that sort of scene, and so that was probably what happened to me when I was reading through it, and that kind of interest in cultural curiosity, and sort of and obviously you've got a lot of obscure tastes, but they're things that I remember myself, but not many people do unless you're of a certain age. So one sort of can resonate with it and relate to it, because it's like,
Fabulous Poodles, for instance.
Yes, well, not many people are going to get excited about that, but I did. I have to say. But it starts, as with all things, childhood memories, and the Wombles plays a big part, and obviously that interest in the Wombles, and somehow with books like this, it kind of unlocks those memories that you've kind of either forgotten because you're just busy, or you don't think they're that interesting. But then as you're trying to make sense of your life as you get older, some of us, you need to sometimes go back to find out where you came from, and then sort of pick through those paths, and trying to be more honest gives you more answers than trying to sort of gloss over things. I suppose
that's a good point. I mean, you mentioned the Wombles. I would say the book is about some quite cool music, but it's also about some quite naff music as well. And I think that's the reality of, being a teenager, I mean, when I watched the Wombles, when I saw ABBA, I was 10 years old watching the Eurovision Song Contest, and I was just wanted to see the Wombles, and I didn't really care about ABBA, but a lot of people might keep that to themselves.
Well, yes, but then, only recently I interviewed dear old Mike Batt from the Wombles, who's now also got his book out. You'll be able to swap books at Christmas probably with Mike and compare notes. He'll be equally sort of intrigued. But yeah, and Stuart Lee's first band, I think, was the Wombles, the comedian. So, I think they're up there. And as Mike Batt said, he tried to write as many different styles of music as possible within that sort of pop remit, because he came from quite a classical background, so he quite enjoyed the being able to do it, and he had a very very famous band as well underneath those outfits.
When you write about the Wombles or watching TV in the 70s, you have to go back to being that 10-year-old, because obviously we know so much now. I now know that one of the Wombles was Robin Le Mesurier, and one of them was Chris Spedding. So I'm thinking of these pretty good guitarists, sort of in these very hot costumes with this sort of stage lights on them. I find that's hilarious. But as a child, you know nothing. You're just looking at a bear holding a guitar, and that looks pretty cool.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I mean, as you mentioned, Chris Spedding and was it Robin, did you say?
It was the son of John Le Mesurier, the Dad's Army actor.
Yes.
And he played in the Rod Stewart band.
Yeah. And also, I mean, with the Mike Batt story, interesting enough, that's all about kind of constant failure. Oh, do you want to sort of have a go at this little project? It's like, well, probably, because there's nothing else going. And that was the project that sort of happened. So, yeah, with all these things, you never know what's going to be the one that lucks out, really. And obviously that was that one for Mike, really. But then, because you also reference one of my favourite set of films, That'll Be the Day, which is the David Essex films.
Oh. I mention that because I write about books that I was allowed to read and books I wasn't allowed to read. And I found this book in a sick bay. I was at boarding school when I was 11, I think, briefly, and so I felt very kind of isolated in this cold dormitory. And then this book appeared, and I just got lost in it. And it's not, I mean, again, looking back today, it's not a very well-written book, but it's a very pacey, very, what you might call pulp novel. And it informed me about sort of youth culture in the 50s, which I knew nothing about. And in this school didn't even have a television, or we weren't allowed to read kind of pop magazines. So again, it sort of opened up this little world to me, my little brain. And I don't even think I saw the film, but I just thought, yeah, this is kind of cool. I didn't like the character. He was a bit of a bastard, but I liked the fairgrounds and the jukeboxes and the stuff that has now become a bit cliched. And I think the follow-up was called Stardust.
Yes, with Harry Lagman in.
And Stardust was, I think, a bigger production. And I actually talked to Ray Connolly, the author, while I was writing the book. I wanted to kind of ask him a few questions about the book, and I was wondering why, it's quite, not a lot of people know about it. I was a bit, I didn't understand why it wasn't more known by people, and it's just one of those lost films, I think. People say it's one of these great youth films about set in Britain, but most people remember other movies. But yeah, it's a nice little novella.
Yes, well, it's I quite enjoyed it because having that kind of 70s period, and things like Top of the Pops being so important, and the top 40 on a Sunday evening, on the radio. You reference the glam period with Susie Quattro, which is obviously one of those artists that comes into our consciousness and sort of blows our minds when you're about a 10, 11-year-old, seeing this person, and also those anthemic songs from the 70s, with people like Sweet, Slade, T-Rex, Gary Glitter.
So yeah, I suppose in the book I talk about the idea of being isolated in this institution, and then at the same time, sort of Lou Reed's hanging out with David Bowie in the hotel in Berkeley Square, and what do we know of that? And then glam rock is massive, obviously, in 1973, 74, and I buy this Susie Quattro record, and it sort of hits me between the eyes. And I suppose her sexuality was quite key to that, but also the music itself and the production. If you think about the Mickey Most
Yes.
rack record label and the producers were a couple of guys called Chinny Chap, I think there was their combined name.
Yes.
And if you listen to other records on the label, they use similar tropes. The drum sound is very, very sort of to the forefront. I think they have a lot of chanting, wolf whistles. It's a kind of huge soundscape they've created. So that, to a 10-year-old, is pretty impressive. It's like a 10-year-old's never heard that before in 1974. So I try and convey that sense of salt on the ears and the senses.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's a little bit like the Gary Glitter stuff, isn't it? Rock and Roll Parts 1 and 2, this very sort of dramatic, anthemic kind of rhythm that sort of beats so loudly, and it sort of, again, resonates with a young person. I mean, Gary's...
That's what people felt when they heard Elvis Presley in 1957 or whatever. And maybe rap records were trying to capture that rawness of rock and roll. And I think looking back, that was quite a retrospective image and sound. They were always referencing rock and roll.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
Susie Quattro.
Yeah, I'm going back there, and yeah, I suppose it's the Eddie Cochran, Buddy Holly, Little Richard kind of period, which was quite good. But then the great thing that happens is punk, and obviously you mentioned this kind of change in your musical direction in the book as well, quite a lot. So you're of that generation who managed to sort of become quite influenced by punk, whereas people like me, stuck in the countryside, it didn't sort of happen in those kind of the Waveney Valley areas.
Well, interestingly, the punk influences I described, there's obviously I meet an old friend and he invites me to his house and gives me a Vibrators single, and I don't know what it is, and he tries to sell it to me, and that was in effect the first punk single I ever heard. I ended up buying it for 30p or something, but you say punk didn't exist in the countryside, but I had some cousins who lived in Herefordshire, which is pretty out there, and it was my cousin who first played me Never Mind the Bollocks.
Right.
And then there was a guy down the road who had actually auditioned for the Sex Pistols after Johnny Rotten had left the band. So, and this boy was a real punk rocker, and I just thought he was brilliant because he just had the whole hair, the clothes, he was living the punk lifestyle in a little kind of lane in the middle of Herefordshire.
Amazing. God, so it was all there on your doorstep. Because I think the one thing that
permeated everywhere, the whole society, it was permeated by something to do with punk.
Yes. And when you were writing it, and one thing that I particularly liked was these kind of references to, is it spirograph you mentioned, which very few people, and also things like Gola or Gola training shoes and
Oh,
Adidas
yeah.
t-shirts. I mean, was your memory at this stage, were you, as you were beginning to write it and then rewrite it, were sort of paths in your brain sort of being opened up here?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite, research du temps perdu. It's sort of the little details are the ones that really open your mind again. So that, yeah, if you think about Gola Gola football shoes, I can sort of visualize them, and that then gives me I don't know, a setting or a place, a time. Um, but I think I don't want to. I didn't want to write a book that was just celebrating old stuff. Like, do you remember this? Do you remember that? I find those are good triggers to create, like, authenticity.
Yes, and I think for people like me, it's those details that I particularly like because it show, you couldn't be a creative writer in your 20s writing about this period and getting it quite so factually right. I think that's the thing that I think that these are the moments that you think, oh yeah, God, I can remember that, and then you have to put the book down and think, oh my God, I remember even the adverts of Gola and this kind of excitement with Adidas and Puma and such like. And I even bought a pair of George Best football boots because I thought George Best was so good. And those memories are slightly hazy, but then when you kind of see a book like this, it does bring back. And the spirograph was something that my brother was really excited by and would use a lot. And again, that I think that those things, because there weren't that many toys back in those days, were there? Most of it has been forgotten now.
The cliche to say, oh, we didn't have mobile phones and we amused ourselves, but as you say, there wasn't a lot to amuse ourselves with. So a spirograph, if I'm right in saying, was a pieces of plastic shaped like circles, and you'd put a pen through some of the holes, and you might link some of these plastic circles up together with a elastic band, and you would create these incredible, I guess, designs. And um, this kept us amused for hours.
Hours, hours and hours. It was like,
Yeah.
The world of Subbuteo and I don't Rupert Bear annuals. There weren't that many presents in one stocking or sack, but
There was a magic to these toys because they always looked so amazing in the advert. And when you got them, if you were lucky enough to be given one for Christmas, they were always hugely disappointing and often broke almost immediately.
yes, they weren't that good. So you
They were
couldn't go wrong with a foot. You couldn't go wrong with a football and a pair of socks, really. But then, sort of coming into the '70s, mid '70s, your first band. So tell us about how you came to find your first band and why this particular band.
So yeah, so we had the Susie Quattro, the That'll Be the Day book, and so all these things were sort of telling me subliminally that it's okay to form a band. You could go somewhere cool, and I really wanted to buy a guitar when I was about 10, but obviously they weren't guitars for 10-year-olds, and they were too expensive. So I made guitars out of cardboard and used to mime to stuff using these guitars. So the idea of having a guitar was sort of quite exciting. So when I was 14, or maybe, yeah, I had some money. I think I did some part-time job, and I had £30, and I saw this guitar in a junk shop and basically bought it, and that became the thing I started to write songs on. But when you can write a few songs, you only need 3 chords. You can then approach other people and say, hey, do you want to be the bass player, or do you know a drummer? And it became one of those kind of schoolyard conversations, and eventually you find like-minded souls who'll do it with you, and blag some equipment, or the rehearsal, obviously, which I go into, is the hard one. So where do you rehearse? Obviously, you're going to make a terrible racket, and you're going to annoy the neighbours and your parents. and your parents are going to have to leave the house for the afternoon while you ruin their peace on a Sunday afternoon. So, and my parents were very tolerant, so they didn't go, no, you can't have a guitar. They didn't stop me. They probably thought that this is something he's interested in. So I'm thankful for that. It just happened organically. Once you get the guitar, then the guitar leads to meeting people. And I was a very shy 14-year-old boy. And for me, I wasn't getting picked for the football team. So it was a way in with other people. And when you're playing guitar or talking about chords or song structure, you don't have to talk about yourself. You're just getting away from yourself. I think it really suited my character to be in a band.
Yes, that's quite interesting. And when did were you academically not gifted, but were you going to be quite competent and pass an O levels at this stage?
I think, unfortunately for me, when I formed the band, I was in the middle of doing O levels, so I definitely think that took me away from books and learning. And I think that could be the curse of our generation, is the punk new wave thing sort of derailed a lot of people, myself included. And I think, if I'd been born 10 years earlier, I probably wouldn't have bought a guitar or formed a band. I might have done better in my exams. But, I don't regret that. And I think that, I think joining a band was really great for my personal development. And even at 14 or 15, I was booking gigs, I was organising, transport rehearsals, and all that kind of stuff is what is a lesson for life. It sets you up as someone who can do business, someone who can make things happen. So
yes,
I don't regret that at all.
Yeah, because then as your book was creeping on, and this is those other bits that I found quite exciting, was when you mentioned the Socialist Workers' Party and Morning Star newspaper and Rock Against Racism posters. So had you at that stage already sort of veered into being a angry young lefty?
Well, I suppose I was apolitical, although two people in the band were very left-wing and were affiliated with left-wing parties. And I think it's pretty common in those days. And this is obviously the early days of Thatcher. And among students, I don't think Thatcher was very popular in 1980 or thereabouts. And there were lots of marches, and obviously people like me loved going to the CND rallies to see bands. And there's a part in the book where I turn around to the drummer and go, well, let's face it, we're only here for the bands. And Mick and Alex are the kind of real lefties, and we're sort of sitting on the fence. And so I wasn't writing any kind of political stuff, but we were asked to play on, left-wing meetings, and we were at a C&D gig, I think, in a park in Beckenham, and there was lots of, we saw it all happen around us.
Yes. Because there's this one, that's the C&D, but then you go into sort of talking about the tribal qualities of that period and skinheads and Nazi sympathisers as well.
Yes, so, as well as sort of, as socialists and communists, you had fascists, and there was a horrible scene where we played a gig out in Feltham, and the crowd was Sieg Heiling and pushing each other, and luckily they didn't attack us, but it was pretty scary. And then we had two girl backing singers who they were called the Shakeettes, and I think the Shakeettes were pretty shaken up after the end of the performance.
Yes. So then, interesting enough, in the book, you get into you reference Julian. Is it Julian Temple's Absolute Beginners, or is it The Jam?
No, the book is referenced because obviously in the early 80s, that was another book that I really enjoyed reading. And it's like when you really love a book, you don't really want anyone to make a film of it. And I suppose the film was made a few years later. And later on, I talk about sort of discovering Soho at night, and sort of the Julian Temple film. I just thought it was great, actually, but it did sort of romanticize that Soho in film, and therefore showed what I thought was the rest of the world to this little place I thought I discovered to myself.
Yes, and I guess at that time there had been there's sort of movement with people like Sade and another band called Blue Ronda and Working Week. So there was a sort of a bit of a Latin vibe, jazz, smooth soul sound coming out of London at that stage. I mean, the Blitz Kids had happened as well, hadn't it? And so
that seemed to be like a exclusively London thing. And so my 80s band, we were wearing black polo necks and doing jazz pop and stuff like that. I don't think that people were doing that in NY Hempstead or in Newcastle. I think it's very much a London thing.
Yes, it definitely. I mean, it was all status quo and heavy metal around our area. You just couldn't. Yeah. But then, as you sort of mentioned here, A levels get in the way, don't they? And Alex, he goes to the University of Norwich, or East Anglia, as we like to call it, reading English literature. So at this stage, were you sort of still in that exam period?
So Alex was my school friend and was the bassist in the punk band I was in, and then obviously we all went our separate ways. And Alex was probably more of a punk than I was, and was sort of into quite extreme punk sort of stuff that I wouldn't touch. But anyway, you have musical differences, so we just drifted apart. And the next thing I knew, he tragically died in a accident while at university up in Norwich. So, and I think Alex and I had sort of bonded by our love of Joy Division, and that was a tragic moment. His funeral. He was must have been 20 or 21, and they played Atmosphere by Joy Division at his funeral, and it was really, really, really shocking.
God, it is shocking. I mean, you write about it in the book, and it is just horrendous, because you kind of think, we all did silly things and messed about and survived, but occasionally someone doesn't. So was he was cremated in Norwich, was he?
Yeah, and I mean, I've recently got in touch with people who were in these bands, and a friend called Mick, who was very left wing, and he's come out of the woodwork. Unfortunately, Alex, also known as Chris, he's no longer with us. So I mean, I wonder what he'd be doing today. But hopefully, come to the book launch, and he's on the cover. So in a way, I've tributed, given him a tribute, and this is him here. So he was probably the good-looking one in the band, I would say.
Yes. And was he in uni digs at the time when he died of poisoning?
I think he was not at his own flat. He was crashing over at someone's house near the uni. So I don't know if it made the local news, but I guess that's the sort of stuff that happens. I mean, I mentioned in the book the sort of lack of health and safety growing up, and I think it was just part and parcel of that. We lived in quite a dangerous world, but people weren't so concerned with detail back in those days.
No, there was less health and safety, and though people like to make a joke of it, it's there for a reason. So what happens to you then as the 80s progress? Because this is the golden period of indie pop, and I mean, you reference the C81 cassette. and Squitty Politti and bands like that. And it had Links on as well, bizarrely, and various other, yes.
LY.
Essential Logic, I think, is on it as well, Laura Logic. And but I'm, obviously I'm a C86 person more than C81 person. So yes.
C81 was obviously very radical when it came out, and I think it came out with the NME.
Yes, absolutely.
And, I think Alex gave me his copy, and the one I liked was Squitty Politti. But I think there was some stuff that maybe it wasn't quite so listenable, but it did point towards different musical directions in the 80s, and some of it was very, as I said, very ahead of its time. If you think about all that kind of freeform funk punk, and I can't remember all the bands on it, but it wasn't just loud guitars and people shrieking. Some of it was quite melodic as well.
It was quite experimental. There was a bit of, I think there's a bit of jazz, industrial, there was, like I mentioned, smooth soul with Links, and Laura Logic was on it. So it was good.
For me, by early 80s, I sort of got into more like funk music and black music, and sort of moved away from guitar music. So, and I was buying kind of 12-inch records from Soho record shops. But at the same time, there's the sort of the more popular synth pop music, like the Human League and the Heaven 17, ABC. They were very, very much in my radar too.
Yes. Were you being self-consciously cool? Because you mentioned people like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, and because to be honest, I was very obsessed with John Peel and would love to sort of get all those street sound compilations and just love the sound of it. But I mean, I still listen to. Well, I don't know about listen, but I would say I would still like that music, even if I wouldn't want to play it now, because it's sometimes I think, I used to play this today.
Get the party started.
You can get the party started at all. But you mentioned people like Last Night a DJ Saved My Life, and then sort of On the Road, which again is one of those classic cliches, and kitchen sink dramas that we all love, like A Taste of Honey, Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, and so were you sort of cultivating a cool, sophisticated vibe at this point?
I don't know. I think it was just my friends were listening to this sort of hip hop stuff, and I mentioned a scene where we go to Amsterdam and we've got this big ghetto blaster, and this local guy, rather than sort of telling us off, he gives us this sort of very cool lecture about how we should listen to the sound of the birds or the sound of the trams, or, really look around us. And obviously that's the sort of thing I'd say to someone today as an older person. But back then we were just sort of wanted to be cool, and we were wandering around in our sort of rolled up Levi's and check shirts and listening to hip hop. But I guess kids still do that, don't they? And they live in a world of their own. So eventually you come around to sort of, opening your eyes to other things.
Yes. And then, because I was going to say, as the 80s progressed, you sort of then, your musical taste has changed quite a lot, hasn't it? I mean, you have a chapter called This Charming Man, but you mentioned Steve McQueen by Prefab Sprout, and these other sort of Haircut 100 and Tom Robinson, and sort of, you've sort of started to move into a slightly different vibe at this point.
Yeah, I went from this sort of like, esoteric hip hop stuff, and then
June Brides.
Well, I think one of the drummers was from one of the auditions was from the June Bride. So this we were sort of full on indie pop. I mean, this is us then. So I mean, we sort of looked like pretty much anyone on the indie pop circuit. The singer, whose name in the book is Gavin, he's actually called Paul. He very into pop music, but he was into things like Haircut 100 and Lotus Eaters.
Oh, you mentioned Curiosity Kills the Cat.
Yeah, I mean, that came later. But I think I mentioned a shared love of sort of Orange Juice and Prefab Sprout, and basically guitar bands that aren't playing rock music. And or rock music as we would understand it by, in the sort of eye of the tiger sense of rock music.
Yes.
So I guess that was pretty alternative, wasn't it? And twinned with sort of not being very rocky and wearing check shirts and not playing guitar solos and having a drummer who didn't want to play his toms. That was quite cool.
It was, but it's also quite bland. Listening to some of that, God, that's quite controversial. But I found a lot of that kind of smooth sound of pop in the 80s a little bit bland. I find Blue Nile really quite dull. The production work of Talk I find overwhelmingly sort of grating. And sometimes the lyrics, the Morrissey lyrics, I felt when he was in the Smiths were just so beautifully on it. And some of these other, artists, they seemed a little bit laboured, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, not all bands can have a Morrissey. He was pretty unique, and I think a lot of people copied the sound, including us. And obviously, I couldn't play guitar as well as Johnny Marr, and Paul didn't have the lyrics of Morrissey, but you can still ape that idea. And I think one of the criticisms of my bands was that we tended to chase other people's style or image or musical style, and then when that ran out, we'd find someone else to copy. And I think that was very 80s. I think the 80s did turn over pretty quickly. You might one day be into the Smiths, and then you turn your head, and suddenly you're more into the Blow Monkeys.
Yes,
which is a very different thing.
It is a different. I think the 80s. And I don't know about other decades, but there were certain quick chapters that happened. It started with things like New Paisley and the goth scene and electro music, and then there was kind of psychobilly, and then that indie world. But I think when the Smiths were about for that 5-year period, there was definitely a bit of a chapter when they broke up in '87, and then Ecstasy came along. It was almost like, right, that is definitely out of the way. We're going to be into dance music, we're going to be into Detroit, Chicago house sounds, and then that crept into the Seattle scene. So looking like Smooth Soul Boys it was never going to work, was it?
Well, there's a definite point in the 80s where, well, I mentioned it in the book, that around about 1987, 88, the whole guitar pop thing is just so over. And you can see it. People, friends start going down to Schumann, talking about Ibiza, and then that's it as far as we're concerned, writing 3.5-minute pop songs. And I guess if we'd carried on, we would have had a drum machine and we would have got rid of the guitar. I mean, it would just be the same thing in another guise. And I think that's a bit sad. I think I know a lot of people did that, but
yes. So as the 80s progressed, did you then do the A-levels and then also do the university point during this decade?
Yeah, so I did work. Obviously, I left school.
Because you reference about a job, I can't remember whereabouts in the book, but you do reference or mention about getting a job and being very excited, didn't you?
Well, I leave school and go to work for a year, and I work in this very boring office. But the office job allows me to sort of go clubbing and basically have a work/weekend lifestyle. So while some of my friends are up at uni, I'm sort of, stuck in an office in London but sort of going a bit bonkers, going a bit mad at the weekend, going to the WAG Club and other of these clubs.
Yes.
But then I did go back I went back to the Central London Polytechnic, which is now called Westminster University. So I think it's where Pink Floyd went.
Yes.
They used to call it the Regent Street College, and all the lectures were just off Oxford Circus by the BBC.
Did you say Kingston University?
No, Central London Poly.
Oh, okay.
And it's now called Westminster University. So there was a great student union bar, and I think our first gig was in the uni bar, and obviously we'd see lots of bands were invited along. So yeah, it's a pretty good place to study for. And we used to DJ in this bar, and yeah, it was enjoyable time.
Yes, well, absolutely. So then, as we crept towards the end, when does Daniel Take a Train? When does that sort of band begin? Is that the late 80s or early 90s at this point?
Yeah. So the band starts off as Illicit Kiss, and around, at some point, the people in Illicit Kiss say, "Hang on, all we're doing is sort of taking our indie music around different pubs in London. We're going to the Bull and Gate and the Clarendon Hammersmith and all these little, what we used to call the toilet circuit."
Yes.
Yeah, maybe 20 people might turn up on a Tuesday evening, and maybe the odd confused German tourist would be asking when the real band was on, and so you'd have this experience, but it was going nowhere, and you might get a nice review in a sort of one of these free magazines, but we'd conscientiously decided we would do pop properly, and therefore subverting the whole gig circuit by pretending we were bigger than we were, which I think that was a very 80s thing as well. If you think of Spandau Ballet, playing at the Scala Cinema to an invite-only, guest list, that's the sort of thing we were trying to emulate. So I think one of my friends did that for us. We booked this sort of special gig, and we had invite-only, but again, no record companies signed us after that, and we started playing places like the Limelight in Charing Cross Road, the famous club that I think one of Boy George's friend who had a heroin overdose. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
So we became more of a sort of club band. And in fact, the other day I was laughing with a friend. She said, I went to see you at Le Palais in Hammersmith, but I got turned away because I was looking too scruffy. And it was just like, the doorman wanted her to wear sort of black jeans with a crease in. It was that sort of. We'd moved into a different circle, and every time we played, we thought there'd be record company people there, and sometimes there were, sometimes they weren't. But this became our sort of mission to get signed.
Yes.
I'm going to give you a spoiler, but that led to in some interesting, obviously, experiences and some near misses with getting a record deal.
Yeah, because you mentioned in this, is this around the same? Is this after you'd worked in sort of various clothes shops in Covent Garden and places like that?
This was all at the same time. So I guess one reason why I didn't have a proper job was I just thought something would happen with the band. So I gave it as long as possible for that to happen. And I think I do say in the book that we were in the right place at the right time. We were I was working in central London, I was working in Covent Garden and hanging out in Soho, and the bandmates were too. So the things that could have been aligned very nicely indeed.
Yes.
He didn't get signed, and I suppose in hindsight I can answer why not, but a lot of it's to do with luck, isn't it?
It is. Everyone says, it's about being in the right place, the right time, just the stars lining up and just having a track, at least one song that people can sort of go, wow, that's quite special. And I think that's it. I guess somebody just has to hear something, because you mentioned the members of Big Audio Dynamite, and they'd become so huge in the 80s. I remember seeing them several times at the UEA, and I mean, were they a band that you were quite interested in at that point?
Well, I think that was a band that I think our band couldn't have played that kind of music because of the makeup of the band. But we might look at them and go, "Oh, I think I like the way they wear baseball hats and long Macs, and we could copy that." But no, I think obviously they had a lot more cred, and we might have copied that style, but luckily we didn't. I think, we were playing, we were more like the Smiths or the Blow Monkeys than Big Audio Dynamite. We didn't have, for example, the equipment was very basic. We didn't have drum machines. We didn't have samplers. We were, guitar, bass, drums in a cellar.
Yes.
That was it. I mean, one thing I touch on is that, we should have maybe explored synthesizers or producers. Obviously, still making music today, music is so different the way you put it together. And, I now make music at home and can create better sounds on my own than I did back in 1988.
Yes.
The flick of a switch. So yeah, they were. It was a hard time to be in the band. I think the idea of spending hours and hours and hours in a basement with making mistakes and going over endings and beginnings and getting frustrated, arguing with people, rowing with the band and going out and having a fag and all. I mean, it was hard. I have to say some of it I would say was a waste of time. And I think you could probably tot it up. It might be hours and hours and hours. I think there's a 10,000 hour rule, isn't there? The what's his name?
Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you. Malcolm Gladwell had a book out, and he quoted this figure for it's the amount of hours you need to perfect a skill.
Yes, he did, but that was when the Beatles made Sgt. Pepper, but they'd obviously before Sgt. Pepper had made all those other albums. So it doesn't. I mean,
they to Hamburg, and they played every night. They played 4 times a night.
Yeah, but obviously they got that sound and something special within the 10,000 hours, hadn't they?
Well, that's another question. Why was it the Beatles and not Jerry and the Pacemakers? But I just feel that being in the band in the 80s, when you hear it, you don't think automatically, oh my God, they must have spent hours and hours on that. It just sounds so natural, but it was proper labour, intensive labour.
Yes, I wanted to. I mean, on a slightly different note, I'd watched his documentary because I loved Man United when I was growing up. There was a film about Dennis Law, and and he's been interviewed. He said, as much as you can practice, if you haven't got talent, you're just never going to make it. You've got to have the talent. And though that might seem a bit cruel, at the same time, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because he said, any of those players back then, if you put them in a modern team now, they would shine, as well as the players now, going back 40 years, 50 years, would shine. You just have to have a talent. And I guess with the Beatles, when they started, there was a talent there without the 10,000 hours.
And in pop music as well, you need that thing called charisma. So it's the sort of, when you see someone walk into a room, you think, wow, I want to listen to them, or I want to hear them speak, or I want to hear what they've got to say. And I think maybe our band didn't have that element either.
Yes. But then you reference on this bit about people like Jeffrey Bernard and the Soho scene with John Hurt and sort of Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon. So you obviously at that point in your life was very keen to embrace the boho beatnik lifestyle.
I found it very romantic, and I suppose in the 80s, some of these characters were still alive. And my dad worked in advertising, and he used to drink in the famous French house, and he would actually introduce me to some of these people. And I do remember going to the French house and seeing sort of John Hurt, very worse for wear, but he major movie star, in your pub, and that's pretty cool, isn't it?
Absolutely. Is this the friend that your dad introduced you to, and he said, "Oh, what a lovely boy"?
The thing about that, I was nearly 30, so I just thought, certainly not a boy. But I give him the benefit of the doubt. He'd probably been drinking all day.
Yes.
And he was being nice. And some people weren't so nice. I've had some terrible put downs in these places. And I think I wasn't as serial alcoholic, and I would dip into these pubs after work, but I wasn't drinking them all day.
I think the Coach and Horses had Muriel Belcher, didn't they, and another guy called Norm, who were particularly rude to their customers. So,
Muriel was the Colony Club.
Oh, that's the one, and Norm was
the Coach and Horses.
Yeah, at this stage, you'd gone from your black ghetto, the Bronx, to jazz from the 50s. Were you sort of quite self-consciously kind of wanting to embrace Betty Blue and Diva and Rosalind and the Lions? Were you going through a very self-conscious period at this stage?
I think, because I worked in this quite cool shop on a part-time basis. And one of my friends was really into kind of quite esoteric music, and he would play these mixtapes. So the manager would play sort of Talking Heads or Tom Waits, which was quite cool, it felt. But this guy would start playing sort of jazz or bossa nova, and jazz, I would get into this music, and it kind of seeped into me. So, twinned with the idea you could go to Soho, and I think there was a Soho festival that was started around that time, and my band Daniel Takes a Train started playing on these sort of jazz gigs, and there was a guy called Tommy Chase who was a bebop drummer from Manchester, I think, and he used to come in the shop, and he'd wear these sort of 3-button suits, and he looked like an old mod. But,
yes.
And I would say to him, well, you must have looked a bit stupid, in 70s Manchester. And he goes, no, it was them that looked bloody stupid. So he was giving the impression that he'd always sort of had this jazz style. And people like that were quite inspiring. And then I went to see this guy called Mose Allison, who was he sort of white blues pianist, but he must have been in his 50s or 60s then, and he was brilliant. He wrote the song called Parchment Farm. And it was sort of the early days of sort of Giles Peterson, or there was another DJ called Paul Murphy. So there was a lot of jazz going on in London.
Yes, and then because there was a guy I interviewed a few years ago, Arthur Smith, and he'd gone to the UEA actually in the early 80s. So yes, your paths didn't cross, but your friends might have done. But you mentioned the Tunnel Club and Malcolm Hardee. So did you get sort of into the alternative comedy scene as well?
I was into the music scene, and I think the music came before the comedy. If I'm right in thinking, was happening in the late 80s. So if you think of Vic Reeves and Joe Brown and all that lot, they would have played at the comedy club because the compere was called Malcolm Hardee.
Yes.
He famously urinated in a customer's glass, and when the customer woke up, he sort of bolted this glass down, and the whole sort of place erupted. So that's the sort of place it was, and it was this pub at the entrance of the Blackwall Tunnel, which was at the time was a pretty dodgy place to go. But we played a bill with Tommy Chase, which is this guy I told you about, who was a sort of bebop drummer, and a band called Frank Chickens, who were 2 Japanese girls who would sort of, what was their hit called? But they would
We Are Ninja, Blue Canary.
Yeah, so it's pretty quirky stuff. So there was us, this sort of like pop guitar band. And we were all wearing sort of like cowboy hats and cowboy boots. And I don't know, our image had gone all over the place by then. And that to me kind of spelt the end of the beginning, or it just sort of said, this is it. I mean, we can't go much lower than this. And then Tommy Chase said to me, that ain't jazz, when we came off stage. So, he knew we were shit. And
But it's funny because at the weekend I did an interview with one of the members of the Frank Chickens, so that's why I was like,
they're still going.
Well, she's still doing things. Actually, she's remarkable because, I know she's still doing bits, and I think you can catch them early January 2025 playing live, the Frank Chickens.
Wow.
So do check out. And Cherry Red Records have just got a full CD box set that could be in your stocking this Christmas.
I remember because I used to buy Time Out, see what gigs were on, and they were all. If you open Time Out on I don't know, any time of year, you'd always see Frank Chickens on the listings. I mean, they must have played a million. They must have played a million gigs.
Yes, well, interesting enough, they got sort of slightly picked up by Pete Jenner, who'd been a manager of lots of people, including Pink Floyd and Billy Bragg and various people. So they had their kind of moment in the 80s and continued on ever since. So on various ways.
The night was that comedy was taking over rock and roll, and dance music was taking over guitar pop. So time to do something else.
Yes. So when did you, because in the book you come up to Don't You Forget About Me. This is kind of is this the early 90s at this point?
Yeah, so no. So it sort of ends in 1988 when I head off to Spain.
Let's Get Lost.
Okay, which is Chet Baker song. But anyway, it's I literally got lost and left the band. But I don't want to spoil the ending, but there's a happy news for the band because basically they get discovered by a cool indie label called Fire Station.
Yes, is that UV?
Who do reissue? Yeah, Uwe sort of found a video. We did a video on before we split up. We did a pop video, and for some reason this was on YouTube. And I think only 3 people had seen it. I hadn't even seen it myself. And Uwe saw it, and he wanted to use the song for a compilation album. And then we said, hang on, we've got more songs than this. We can find you more. And we've dug out all our old demos, and we managed to put together an album. So it was kind of rebirth of this band that split up in 1988. And the last chapter kind of explores that idea of guys in their 50s who, get all excited and relive their youth. And, in my case, I had to learn the guitar again, and I wasn't really listening to much music. I had young children, and I had to leave an interview to go and pick up my daughter from a sleepover, that kind of stuff. So again, there's comic value throughout. So this is.
Did you reevaluate that period and that time and thought, because you sounded quite critical of it, as if it had been a complete waste and you wish you never had the guitar. Did it make you feel like actually without that moment and all that time in the 80s, you would have had a rather boring narrative and life without the band?
Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, I started the book by thinking, well, clearly I did waste my time because this band didn't go anywhere. We had some fun, but I didn't make any money out of it. But I've got this album out, retrospective album out, and that's kind of a nice memento. But was it worth it? Yes, because I've written a book and I've enjoyed writing the book, and I'm talking to you about it. So I think I've made those memories come alive, hopefully.
Yeah, and people. You've kept the people alive, which I think is rather delightful.
And maybe a lot of people have had similar experiences. I mean, for every successful band, there's probably hundreds of people who haven't made it. So they probably share a similar story.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think it's delightful. I think it's a great bit of social history as well. I think for me, the 80s used to be very told by a couple of commentators, like Dylan Jones, and it was always about the, Spandau Ballet and Live Aid. And I remember thinking, actually, that wasn't my 80s at all. It was all very angsty and indie pop and, getting into John Peel and the NME and sort of getting very excited with these kind of little indie songs, but then getting excited with rap music and the Bundy Boys and Gregory Isaacs and going to London to see, this UK Fresh event at Wembley Arena with all these cool American bands like African Bambaataa and Grandmaster Flash and Mantronics and that was the 80s, as well as Red Wedge and the Redskins and the Frank Chickens. We loved them.
There's a lot happening in the 80s, and obviously I wasn't at all 80s moments, as you can tell. But I did, our paths crossed in many different people.
Yes.
Going up, some were going down. And I agree with you. It was a really, really interesting time. And, the book really only really focuses on 4 or 5 years, and there's a lot in there.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, that's why I like the childhood bit and those kind of moments and those little kind of comments, which obviously, add in them rather than going into great detail, just for the reader who was there, it jogs that memory as well and puts a bit of a nod and a smile and oh gosh, yes, that reminds me of something that I remember, which I had forgotten about, which is all very important as we creep into our 60s.
Well, there's also a soundtrack to, I wouldn't say the book, and that in a way it's music that I didn't, not necessarily music I like, but it's music that kind of affected me and maybe is relevant to certain scenes in the book. So
is this on Spotify?
It's on Spotify. So if you buy the book, you can, or just look it up on Spotify. Whatever Happened to the Teenage Dream.
Right, I'm going to be there.
It's songs of my life that affected the book. So as I said, they're not my favourite songs. There's a song by Fabulous Poodles. There's punk stuff, or there's Shannon, Let the Music Play, which I love that song. And there's stuff that I don't know, the Smiths, Prefab Sprout, Joy Division. So it's the music of our lives, but
God, I'm this. I know this is good radio. This is, I tell you, this is a good podcast. And What Happened to the Teenage? Oh God, that's T-Rex, isn't it? Teenage Dream. Is it Dream?
Whatever Happened to the Teenage Dream on Spotify playlist. So I haven't got the Wombles, but I've got Cat Stevens, Alan Price, the Ruttles, who I loved.
We love them.
John Barry, because of the theme from The Persuaders, and stuff like, not very cool stuff by Martha and the Muffins and the Undertones, which is kind of my new wave time.
Oh, Martha's lovely. I mean, that's a delight, really. It's all got to be there. Oh, this is great. I love a good soundtrack, actually. But the Fabulous Poodles. Shame about the Wombles, though.
And there's a track called "I Believe in Miracles," which
the Jackson Sisters.
Jackson Sisters, which around 1987, that was all over the place, all over the clubs, and I really got into rare groove around that time, and I started buying kind of old sort of movie soundtracks by Isaac Hayes and stuff like that, and I really wanted to start a band that was just playing instrumental cover versions of Shaft in Africa and stuff like that. And the other idea I had was to sort of do a Sergio Mendes tribute.
Yes.
All at the same time while I was playing in a Daniel Takes a Train, which was a sort of pop guitar band.
See, that idea, I think, was it the James Taylor Quartet? I think
was I ahead of the game there, but I didn't actually do it, but I was thinking about it.
You were ahead of the game. That dream was the one, wasn't it? That was the one that could have done it.
Yeah.
Because I think James Taylor of the James Taylor Quartet, I think he was in a band which was modish, but didn't go anywhere. And then he became a solo artist and did that sound, and it became really popular and has run with it ever since.
Hammond organ, yeah. Well, I mean, I was in bands, and we were sort of close to acid jazz. But I should have done it in 1987.
You would have been so on the zeitgeist. You would have been creating the zeitgeist. So then, going forward, you've got this book, which is fantastic. Do you have any more musical moments with the band or any other musical projects?
Well, having got back into music by reforming the band a few years ago, the band the Daniel Train is still recording and are doing okay. I mean, we got into the Heritage chart to number 3, I think, last year with a single
Right.
Be Happy. So unfortunately, the band don't live so close together as they used to. So some of
Yes.
us down in Kent, some of us are in London, just outside London. So, and I've just had my studio taken apart, so I need to get all my music stuff back again. But I will write more stuff. And I did record a special song on green flexi-disc vinyl for the release of the book. So if you come to my book launch next Thursday and buy the book, you get a free flexi disc. So that, again, entering the spirit of new wave.
Yes, absolutely. Well,
This song is called "The Soundtrack of Our Lives" by my solo project Who Shot Liberty. You can also download it, but get the flexi disc. Or
yeah, well, absolutely. You've got to
have you
keep it.
played one of these recently? I mean, they do actually play.
I haven't played a flexi disc for a very long time, but I have a few still knocking about, and also all those ones that used to be stuck to the front of the NME and Melody Maker.
No doubt you bought a magazine called Flexi Pop back in the day.
I heard about it, but I don't think I bought it. I shouldn't have confessed that, should I? That was a shocker.
I think people used to basically tear the disc off the magazine and run out of WH Smiths if they wanted it.
That was that called Flexi Pop?
Flexi Pop, yeah.
Oh, that's a shame. So look, give us the because if I'm really together, I could get this up for you, and then you could put it on your social media platform sites. So when next Thursday, which is the 21st,
Send you a link.
send me a link, yes, and then I'll put it up, and then you could just put it out there, and hopefully, is it in London?
It's in central London. It's at the Wheatsheaf, where lots of very bohemian writers used to drink before the war. Not that makes a difference, but come and meet me. Hopefully buy a book. I'll do a reading. We're doing a Q&A event with a friend of mine, Bill, who worked for GQ and Esquire. And it's going to be a fabulous evening, and there'll be T-shirts, badges, books, and flexi discs, and lots of new wave music sort of bursting out of the speakers.
It's going to be brilliant. It's going to be a little love fest, isn't it?
Hopefully, yeah.
Oh, this is what we need in society, more sort of indie pop. But look, this has been fantastic. Well, thank you again for giving me the time for this. And I've really, loved, I mean, I will sort of, I had to slightly skim the book a bit, but the time pressures of life, but it's a delightful read, and I have to say I'm glad
you got it, because I think, as you said, there's a lot of memoirs that, I mean, most memoirs are interesting, but I, like you, I don't read a lot of rock memoirs. I like books that are more observant. I really like the Michael Bracewell book about London in the early 80s called Souvenir.
Yes.
He describes so well that moment that sort of deadbeat London becomes kind of style and glamour and nightclubs and synth pop, and it's a very captures that moment really well, which is the moment I remember.
Yes. What other books do you recommend?
I like there may not be, well, That'll Be the Day, obviously, by Ray Connolly, the book I read when I was 10 years old, and I really like All in It Together by Alwyn Turner, about the noughties. Again, this is not a memoir, but it's sort of, I like the way he brings in sort of pop music and politics, puts it all together. And have you read Sick or New by the guy from the Hollywood Brats?
No, Sick.
Talking of, and apparently I'm in a genre called bands that didn't make it. So there's a bookshop that, I'm in the bands that didn't make it section. And so Hollywood Brats would be in a similar place to me. And they were, I think they were a glam rock band from the pre-punk days that were going to be massive. And I think there was drugs and stuff like that. But the guy writes really well. That's really funny.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll definitely check that out. Any others? We love the book.
Do you mean rock books or
just rock books, really?
Well, really. I mean, I did very clearly try to stop writing about rock music and write a memoir. I mean, I like the memoir by Viv Albertine.
Yeah.
And I thought Tracy Thorn was really good. And she wrote about growing up in, where was it? I can't remember. But no, I think hopefully my book doesn't just deal with music. It deals with friendships, relationships, growing up, all those things that we face as a younger person.
And that was me in conversation with Dan Synge, talking about his book, Whatever Happened to the Teenage Dream. And as I said, I'll put links in the notes below so you can buy a copy. But it's a beautiful book, so do check it out. It's heartwarming, poignant, and slightly sort of, yeah, I know it's a bit sad at times, but beautifully told. So yeah, check it out. Anyway, this is the C86 show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 show. All these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. So you yes, check it out. And yes, that's it really. Have a great week. Stay safe.